Today we're building this, a 1440p gaming system that takes up a very minimal footprint on your desk, runs incredibly quiet, and yes, it can in fact run Cyberpunk 2077. And I completely understand that some of these parts, mainly the GPU and the processor, are a bit hard to get your hands on at the moment, but I still think that it's totally worth taking a look at a build that I do recommend at this particular price point. So let's take a look at what specific parts we're using here, how to put it all together, and then how it performs. So in planning an ITX PC build, it all starts with the case, because that determines what other hardware you can accommodate, like your CPU cooler and the size of your graphics card. And for a gaming focused build like this, I think the Phanteks Evolv Shift 2 Air is perfect. Nice small footprint and plenty of ventilation through those mesh side panels. I've actually done a full review on this case if you happen to missed it, and all of the changes that have been made versus the original Evolv Shift. Overall, the changes have been very welcomed. The CPU that we're using for this build is the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 5600X, which I think is perfect for mainstream to high-end gaming builds today. AMD really knocked it out of the park with Ryzen 5000, and the 6-core model is no exception. As the current generation of GPUs from both Nvidia and AMD offer so much performance, it's really important that we go with a CPU here that isn't going to bottleneck our gaming performance, not only now, but also for future GPU upgrades. The 5600X is easily a processor that I see outliving and supporting multiple GPU generations in the years to come. Now, your best option in terms of CPU cooling in the Evolv Shift 2 is a 120mm AIO, but this can also potentially cause problems for some liquid cooler models. With air traveling to the top of the loop and then circulating into the pump, you could end up with some irritating noises and potentially shorten the lifespan of your cooler. So we're not going to take any chances here for a build guide like this, so we're using Be Quiet's Pure Loop 120, and this has the pump located in the tubing portion of the cooler instead of the CPU block portion. This way you don't have anything to worry about in terms of air circulating in the loop, and any air towards the CPU block should be minimal enough to not affect cooling performance. Then for the motherboard, we're going with the best performing B550 ITX motherboard that I've tested, and that's Gigabyte's B550i Aorus Pro AX. This board has the strongest VRM out of all of the B550 ITX boards available. It's a 6+2 phase layout with 90 amp power stages. This board doesn't have any active cooling in terms of chipset fans or VRM fans, and honestly, with a VRM that runs this cool, an active VRM fan just wouldn't be necessary. The only downside when it comes to this board is that it's the only B550 ITX board to not support an onboard USB Type-C header, but that's not a problem for our build, seeing as the Evolv Shift 2 doesn't have a front USB Type-C port anyway. For the graphics card, we're going with the RTX 3060 Ti, and the specific card that we're using here is MSI's Gaming X Trio. Despite this being a 2.5 slot triple fan card, it does actually fit in the Evolv Shift 2 with a bit of breathing room. Now, to be completely honest, with a 200 watt TDP, you just don't need this much cooling for a 3060 Ti, but this will give us a significantly quieter system in the end. So this is a premium card, and the main thing that you'll want to look out for here is the pricing. Typically, premium 3060 Ti's should be avoided because pricing can start to creep up to base RTX 3070 pricing, so definitely do consider the pricing in your region and make sure that you are not spending as much as a 3070 for this particular card. The power supply that we're using is Corsair's SF600 Platinum, which is plenty for this build here. With an 80+ platinum efficiency and a full set of sleeved cables, this is one of my top picks for a mid-range gaming build. For storage, it's really going to come down to your own preferences and needs. I'm keeping it really simple here with a single 1TB M.2 NVMe drive from Crucial. Then for memory, a 16GB 3200MHz CO15 kit from Corsair. Then for some optional extras, a 140mm intake fan is recommended here to encourage cool air towards our radiator, and I've also added in a couple of RGB strips from Phanteks. And so here it is, the completed build, and I think we'd all agree that it looks pretty tidy and neat, and quite a bit bright and colorful as well. But this build took so much longer than I had expected, and I'll save you most of the droning on and all of the problems that I had. But the short of it is, the B550i Pro AX from Gigabyte that I had in there initially, for whatever reason, I just could not get any boot from that motherboard at all, or rather I couldn't get any post from it. Everything in the system would turn on in the way of the power supply, the fans and the lighting, but I was just getting no display from the system at all. So of course I tried a new motherboard BIOS for our Ryzen 5000 CPU, but that surprisingly didn't work, at which point I used a PCIe Gen 3 GPU because I thought that could have been the entire issue. That didn't help it. I then swapped out to a Ryzen 3000 CPU, then swapped the memory, then swapped the boot drive, and really nothing could fix the issue. Still no display from the system. So I ended up just throwing in the Asus B550i Strix, and apart from the PCIe Gen 3 riser cable issue, which I've mentioned previously, I was able to get the system up and running quite fine. Also, a little side rant for case manufacturers which may be watching this video, even including Phanteks with their Evolv Shift 2, it is simply unacceptable to ship a case like this with a PCIe Gen 3 riser when modern hardware clearly has moved beyond that, and it's not for performance issues or anything like that, it's purely about compatibility and the user experience. I've lost so many hours trying to troubleshoot display issues between Gen 4 GPUs and PCIe Gen 3 risers, so please let's just all move to PCIe Gen 4 riser cables and make everyone's days a lot easier. Otherwise, those problems aside, I'm really happy with how this system turned out. The Be Quiet Pure Loop 120 fits in there really nicely, and it almost feels like it was designed specifically for this case. One thing to note though is that you will have to feed the tubing and the pump in front of the radiator fan for everything to fit in there properly. Even then, there is still a bit of excess tubing in the bottom between the power supply and the graphics card, and this actually pushes the card outwards a bit at the bottom, so just keep that in mind. It's nothing major and the side panel still goes on fine, but just something to note, especially if you are planning on using a slightly thicker card than this. Cable management was also a bit of a challenge, but that's partly due to me using 2 RGB strips and 2 RGB fans and having all of the separate wiring for that. Speaking of RGB strips, I've hidden those behind the frame of the case to try and hide the individual LEDs. The goal there was just to try and achieve some extra illumination on the opposite side of the case as the RGB fans, and I think that turned out quite well. By the way, all of the RGB lighting is hooked up to the integrated lighting controller on the Evolv Shift 2, which is definitely appreciated. It can easily be controlled via the 2 buttons at the top of the case to cycle through modes and colors. But of course, now let's talk about performance, the most important thing when you're spending $1,500 US on a gaming PC. Now, some of you may remember that I outlined some issues that I was encountering in a previous build when using a Ryzen 5000 CPU on either the B550i Asus Strix or X570 Strix. And those issues don't seem to be completely resolved just yet, even with the latest motherboard BIOS. Our Ryzen 5600X, for example, is boosting to just 4.2 GHz on all cores in Cinebench, whereas typically you'd see that a little bit closer to 4.4. Now, I was able to overcome this by enabling the Asus Performance Enhancement setting in the BIOS. That brought clock speeds and performance right up to the expected levels. And I will note at the same time, this is not like overclocking the CPU, because with this enabled, the CPU was still sitting below its default socket power budget of 88 watts at just around 75 watts. So definitely do make sure that you've got this enabled for Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Now, when it comes to thermal performance, there's really good news here. After 40 minutes driving around in Cyberpunk 2077, our RTX 3060 Ti was topping out at just 67 degrees C, and that's with a fan speed of just 1200 RPM. Then for CPU thermals, while not displayed in MSI Afterburner, they were topping out at around 75C, which is what I'd expect for a 5600X under gaming load. This was with all of the fans in the system at just 1200 RPM, and that was incredibly quiet. So for a little under $1,500 you're getting exceptional performance, and that's mostly thanks to the RTX 3060 Ti. At just $400 we're getting gaming performance that's consistently beating the RTX 2080 before it. One of the most demanding titles currently, Cyberpunk 2077, can be played at 1440p while using the DLSS performance mode and ray trace reflections enabled. This lands us with a frame rate around 70 to 90 FPS depending on the area in the game. And we all know this game is incredibly demanding, so most other games will have absolutely no problem handling this resolution, so definitely consider a high refresh rate 1440p gaming monitor to pair this with if you haven't already. And if you want to get a better scope of RTX 3060 Ti performance as a whole, I will leave my review down below. So this is a build and configuration that I can highly recommend. It runs incredibly quiet, runs very cool, and takes up barely any room on your desk, which personally I'm a little bit biased towards. I really love the vertical form factor of this case and just the tiny footprint that this has. If you are interested in any of the parts and perhaps putting this whole thing together, I will leave all of the parts linked down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.